U.S. President Joe Biden is addressing the media after his earlier chat with his counterpart in Russia, Vladimir Putin. Let's see if we can listen into that.
Radio liberty to operate and the importance of a free press and freedom of speech. I made it clear that we will not tolerate attempts to violate our democratic sovereignty or destabilize our democratic elections, and we would respond. The bottom line is, I told President Putin that we need to have some basic rules of the road that we can all abide by. I also said there are areas where there's a mutual interest for us to cooperate. For our people, Russian and American people, but also for the benefit of the world and the security of the world. One of those areas is strategic stability. You asked me many times, what was I going to discuss with Putin before I came? I told you I only negotiate with the individual, and now I can tell you what I was intending to do all along. And that is to discuss and raise the issue of strategic stability and try to set up a mechanism whereby we dealt with it. We discussed in detail the next steps our country should take on arms control measures, the steps we need to take to reduce the risk of unintended conflict. And I'm pleased that we agreed today to launch a bilateral strategic stability dialogue. Diplomatic speak for saying, get our military experts and our diplomats together to work on a mechanism that can lead to control of new and dangerous and sophisticated weapons that are coming on the scene now, that reduce the times of response, that raise the prospects of accidental war. And we went into some detail of what those weapon systems were. Another area we spent a great deal of time on was cyber and cybersecurity. I talked about the proposition that certain critical infrastructure should be off limits to attack, period, by cyber or any other means. I gave them a list. If I'm not mistaken, I don't have it in front of me, 16 specific entities, 16 defined as critical infrastructure under U.S. policy, from the energy sector to our water systems. Of course, the principle is one thing. It has to be backed up by practice. Responsible countries need to take action against criminals who conduct ransomware activities on their territory. So we agreed to task experts in both our countries to work on specific understandings about what's off limits and to follow up on specific cases that originate in other countries, in either of our countries. There's a long list of other things we spent time on, from the urgent need to preserve and reopen the humanitarian corridors in Syria so that we can get food, just simple food and basic necessities, to people who are starving to death. How to build it and how it is in the interest of both Russia and the United States to ensure that Iran does not acquire nuclear weapons. We agreed to work together there because as much as Russia's interest is ours. And to how we can ensure the Arctic remains a region of cooperation rather than conflict. I caught part of President Putin's press conference, and he talked about the need for us to be able to have some kind of modus operandi where we dealt with making sure the Arctic was, in fact, a free zone. And to how we can each contribute to the shared effort of preventing the resurgence of terrorism in Afghanistan. It's very much in the interest of Russia not to have a resurgence of terrorism in Afghanistan. There are also areas that are more challenging. I communicated the United States' unwavering commitment to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. We agreed to pursue diplomacy related to the Minsk agreement. And I shared our concern about Belarus. He didn't disagree with what happened. He just has a different perspective of what to do about it. But I know you have a lot of questions, so let me close with this. It was important to meet in person, so there can be no mistake about or misrepresentations about what I wanted to communicate. I did what I came to do. Number one, identify areas of practical work our two countries can do to advance our mutual interest and also benefit the world. Two, communicate directly that the United States will respond to actions that impair our vital interest or those of our allies. And three, to clearly lay out our country's priorities and our values, so he heard it straight from me. And I must tell you, the tone of the entire meetings, I guess it was a total of 4 hours, was good, positive. There wasn't any strident action taken. Where we disagreed, I disagreed, stated where it was. Where he disagreed, he stated. But it was not done in a hyperbolic atmosphere. That is too much of what's been going on. Over this last week, I believe, I hope, the United States has shown the world that we are back, standing with our allies. We rallied our fellow democracies to make concerted commitments to take on the biggest challenges our world faces. And now we've established a clear basis on how we intend to deal with Russia and the U.S.-Russian relationship. There's much more work ahead. I'm not suggesting that any of this is done. We've gotten a lot of business done on this trip. And before I take your questions, I want to say one last thing. Folks, look, this is about how we move from here. I listened to, again, a significant portion of what President Putin's press conference was. And as he pointed out, this is about practical, straightforward, no-nonsense decisions that we have to make or not make. We'll find out within the next 6 months to a year whether or not we actually have a strategic dialogue that matters. We'll find out whether we work to deal with everything from release of people in Russian prisons or not. We'll find out whether we have a cybersecurity arrangement that begins to bring some order. Because look, the countries that most are likely to be damaged, failure to do that, are the major countries. For example, when I talked about the pipeline that cyber hit for $5 million, that ransomware hit in the United States, I looked at him and I said, well, how would you feel if ransomware took on the pipelines from your oil fields? He said it would matter. This is not about just our self-interest. It's about a mutual self-interest. I'll take your questions, and as usual, folks, they gave me a list of the people I'm going to call on. So, Jonathan, Associated Press.
Thank you, sir. U.S. intelligence has said that Russia tried to interfere in the last two presidential elections and that Russia groups are behind hacks like SolarWinds and some of the ransomware attacks you just mentioned. Putin, in his news conference just now, accepted no responsibility for any misbehavior. Your predecessor opted not to demand that Putin stop these disruptions. So what is something that concrete, sir, that you achieved today to prevent that from happening again, and what were the consequences you threatened him?
Whether I stopped it from happening again, he knows I will take action, like we did when this last time out. What happened was we, in fact, made it clear that we were not going to continue to allow this to go on. The end result was we ended up withdrawing. They went withdrawing ambassadors. We closed down some of their facilities in the United States, et cetera. He knows there are consequences. Now, look, one of the consequences that I shouldn't say this, it's unfair of me. I suspect you may all think doesn't matter. But I'm confident matters to him, I'm confident matter to him and to other world leaders of big nations. His credibility worldwide shrinks. Let's get this straight. How would it be if the United States were viewed by the rest of the world as interfering with the elections directly of other countries and everybody knew it? What would it be like if we engaged in activities that he is engaged in? It diminishes the standing of a country that is desperately trying to make sure it maintains its standing as a major world power. And so it's not just...
All right, that's U.S. President Joe Biden speaking in Geneva after his talks with the Russian leader. there reiterating his strong belief clearly that Russia tried to interfere in U.S. elections. That is one of the claims against Vladimir Putin. Now, earlier, the Russian president described his hours-long meeting with the U.S. president as constructive and one lacking in hostility. So they seem to be agreeing on that issue. He was the first of the two presidents to address the media after that historic summit in Geneva ended a short time ago. He confirmed that the country's ambassadors would be returned to both capitals after both were recalled amid strained relations earlier this year when President Biden referred to his Russian counterpart as a killer. Topics also ranged from growing concerns around cybersecurity. We've heard Joe Biden touch on that now. Human rights and efforts to reduce both countries' stockpiles of nuclear weapons. Let's take a look at what happened earlier.
As for the overall assessment, I believe there's been no hostility. On the contrary, our meeting took place in a constructive spirit. Indeed, we have varied assessments on a number of issues, but both sides expressed their intention to understand each other and to seek common ground. Talks were quite constructive. As for cybersecurity, we agreed that we would begin consultations in this respect. I believe it is extremely important. As for responsibilities and who should take them,
all right, let's chat to our correspondent, Sherwin Bryce-Pease. He's been watching these events in Geneva very closely for us, and he joins us live from New York. Welcome, Sherwin. Let's start with Joe Biden talking a short while ago. And let's just set the context here that relations are said to be at the lowest point in 30 years or so. Russia willing to interfere in U.S. elections. Joe Biden bringing up that. He said before that he believes Putin is a killer. After that context, did you hear any sense of breakthrough in what Joe Biden was saying?
Well, let's give a nod to the Swiss hosts. Remember, you are in one of the multilateral capitals of the world called Geneva, Switzerland. The context or the venue for those all-important historic talks between two of the most powerful leaders in the world, a place called Villa Lagrange on Lake Geneva. So the multilateral fora that this city represents, perhaps having sway on the two leaders in their engagement. And yes, I think given the fact that you have two separate press conferences by both these leaders. You'll remember when former President Donald Trump met Vladimir Putin in Finland, they did a joint press conference. So the concern was that we might get divergent views as to how the meeting went. And what you're hearing from both sides is that Moscow and Washington have a strategic and important relationship in terms of creating and generating peace in the world. You'll also understand, Francis, that these are the two countries in the world with the most nuclear weapons systems available to them. They both talked about the relaunch and the renewal of the New START treaty. This is an effort between both countries to reduce their nuclear weapons stockpiles. President Biden, of course, talking about how this was a straightforward meeting, that there is no substitute for face-to-face dialogue, the importance of managing relations between two powerful countries, the importance of having stable and predictable and rational relationships. He said he wanted Putin to understand why I say what I do and why I do what I do. The U.S. agenda is not against Russia or anyone. It's for the American people. It's about protecting the American people. He talked about how that was his responsibility as president. Earlier on, we heard from Vladimir Putin talking about the U.S.-Russia strategic relationship and how that creates stability in the world. He also talked about the New START treaty. He said there was no hostility in the meeting, that it was held in a constructive tone. They talked about a number of issues as it pertains to climate change, as it pertains to free navigation in the Arctic, but also the question of human rights, and a number of questions going to the Russian leader, Francis, about various human right permutations in his own country. Let's listen to how he responded to one of those questions. This was Vladimir Putin earlier today.
President Biden has indeed touched on the subject of human rights and the subject of people who think they are fully in tune with the subjects, with this topic in Russia. We've discussed this. We've discussed harsh statements as well. We've heard them. He called me right afterwards. He explained himself, and I was fully all right with what he said. He offered to meet. I mean, this was his initiative. We've met, and once again, the conversation was quite constructive, and I once again understood that President Biden is an experienced statesman. Our one-on-one conversation took almost 2 hours. It's not every world leader that gets this amount of attention. I mean, his predecessor was asked the same question. He evaded this. This president decided to respond to the question directly. And in this, he is very different from President Trump.
President Putin's ego perhaps infiltrating that question a little bit there, that answer there, Francis. It's not every world leader that gets that amount of attention from the Russian leader, talking about the length of their engagements in Geneva. On the whole, one gets a sense that this was an amicable tone, and they talk about how their ambassadors will now be returned to both capitals, and how, in terms of issues around cybersecurity, election interference and so forth, that there will be a strategic engagement between the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Russia and the State Department to take those red lines forward, how far you can go in terms of these cyber attacks and ransomware attacks that have proliferated various federal agencies, private companies, and strategic infrastructure, including energy infrastructure in the United States. That, I think, was probably one of the toughest conversations they had. But of course, now it's going to fall to the leadership of Sergei Lavrov, who is the foreign minister in Russia, and Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, to take those discussions further than what the two heads of state have done so far.
Sherwin, there was so much curiosity, I think, before this as to how these two leaders would interact, especially because Joe Biden's predecessor, Donald Trump, seemed to admire the machismo of Vladimir Putin, and now a very different relationship. So now, because they're not doing these joint press conferences, we can't see the body language, but there were some interchanges before. What's the sense here? And also what you've outlined about what they've said, I guess it sounds like two world leaders who are at least willing to listen to one another.
Well, I think what you have here are two very experienced leaders that have been at the top of their political game for a very long time. Biden, of course, was a United States senator, a vice president under the Obama administration, and our president of the United States. Vladimir Putin has been at the helm of Russian political life, whether as prime minister or president, for all of the 21st century. And that stay is likely to extend through the decade, if not more, given various legislation that he has signed to extend the lifespan of his Russian presidency. So they understand the game, they understand geopolitics, and I think there's a mutual respect for that. You have to understand that this is not just about their personalities, this is about the countries that they represent and the influence that these countries seek to continue to have in places, in multilateral fora, particularly at places like the UN Security Council. Russia has a very big role to play in terms of how we get to a political solution, for example, in Syria. This is a long-standing item on the UN security agenda. They have the greatest influence on Bashar al-Assad in Syria, and so what role can the United States play in bringing Russia closer to what it seeks to achieve in those areas? There are also areas of mutual concern as it pertains to climate change, of course a global concern, achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, improving human rights around the globe. Look, this is a fight between authoritarianism, as President Biden will explain, and giving an air of wind, or certainly a shot in the arm to the fragility that democracies have experienced in the last decade. And I think that's what you're seeing play out when Biden and Putin meet one-on-one. It is about Biden seeking to show that democracies are still powerful, not, of course, denying the fact that he was in Europe before this to meet with the EU, to meet with NATO, to meet at the G7, really having the wind at his back to say, we are back and we are going to coalesce around democracies in the world as a counterpoint to what the United States sees as Russia's rise and China's rise in terms of authoritarianism and the strain that is placing on geopolitics around the world. This is the bigger picture that is at play here, beyond how Joe Biden feels and certainly how his counterpart in Russia feels about him.
All right, well, thank you for following that. Let's see how it pans out. The talks about arms control, so nothing agreed, but talks coming up, ambassadors returning. You'll follow all that for us. Sherwin Bryce-Pease, our U.S. correspondent, reporting live from New York.